Hello and welcome to CANNAMAntv. In this interview, I speak with physician, medical cannabis specialist, instructor at Harvard Medical School, and author of Seeing Through the Smoke, a cannabis expert untangles the truth about marijuana, Dr. Peter Grinspoon. In this interview, we discuss Peter's childhood and introduction to cannabis, Cannabis Hyperemesis syndrome, Cannabis Use Disorder, cannabis and autism, cannabis and sleep, and the endocannabinoid system. Make sure and like and subscribe, and join me on Patreon for exclusive behind-the-scenes content. I'll provide a one-time payment to PayPal, where you could help to build a stronger media platform. Now then, let's talk cannabis.
What part of the UK are you in?
I'm in Scotland.
Oh, in Scotland, cool.
Yeah.
I've been to Scotland. It's supposed to be beautiful.
Yeah, it is. Although, if you don't like rain, you might be in for a shock.
Oh, I love rain. My wife absolutely loves rain, and I like it just as much as a sunny day. I don't like being like really hot, like the sun, 100 degrees. So I like the rain.
Yeah, excellent. I'm the same actually. The noise of rain hitting like a tin roof, it's like music for me. You know, I love that.
Yeah, it's absolutely beautiful. It's really nice. It's beautiful. Yeah, one day we'll make it up to Scotland.
Yeah, quite well. When you do, please let me know, and it'd be phenomenal to meet you in person.
Absolutely, that'd be really fun.
Well, this is an absolute honour, Peter. Honestly, I mean, it really is. I can't thank you enough for giving me your time here, and your book. Phenomenal. Like, quite honestly, I really wish that I had more time. Only arrived last Monday, so I really wish I had more time to read all of it, because it's quite honestly, it's a Bible. It's phenomenal. I mean, how long were you working on this?
Well, I would say about 4 years, honestly. I mean, a long time. Sorry, it's like my recording situations. I could either look at you or I could look at the camera, so it looks like I'm looking at you.
Okay.
So
yeah, just whatever you like.
Yeah, when we talk, I look at the camera. But when we're recording. But so it took me like 4 years, but I've been involved in the issue for like my whole life. So I would, I'd say I've been working the book for 4 years, but I grew up with all these people in my living room discussing legalization. The peace pipe was floating around, and I've been involved in the movement my whole life. So the book, 4 years, but I'd say it's like a lifelong project.
Yeah. One of the brilliant parts when I was reading over it was the mention of Carol Sagan in the living room sharing a joint with your dad. I was not expecting that at all. I mean, talk me through that.
Hold on.
Oh, phenomenal.
My dad he was the first man at Carl's first wedding. So that's a picture of them.
That is so cool. That is just unbelievably cool.
Yeah, he used to like edit my papers in high school when I'd show him a paper. He'd be like, "That's good. Why don't you try doing this?" It was really cool.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of essentially the first question I was going to ask was, could you detail your introduction to cannabis? I mean, it's really, the book for so many different reasons is a brilliant read, and I'll put the link in the description box below. I strongly recommend pro-cannabis people, against cannabis individuals. Everybody should read this. It's phenomenal. And one of the things I picked up the most was your lived experience. You can tell this book was written by somebody who's not exclusively a practitioner. This is somebody that's had lived experience. So before we get into all that, detail your introduction, your first few memories of what cannabis was and how you went about it.
Sure. Well, there are two main reasons why I could say that I've been involved with cannabis my entire life. I mean, more than two. I mean, as a primary care doctor and cannabis specialist, I've been treating people with cannabis for several decades. So I feel very comfortable with it clinically, but also it's fair to say that I grew up with it. Number one, my brother Danny, when he was fighting an unsuccessful battle against leukemia, my parents bought him cannabis to try to help him contend with the side effects of the chemotherapy he was getting. And it was really amazing to see. I mean, there's nothing like witnessing the alleviation of suffering in a family member. And my brother Danny, I was like 8 years old. My brother Danny was 16. And when he didn't use cannabis, he was just lying alone in his bedroom throwing up. And when he used cannabis, he was able to eat, to come down and interact with people, to play with his little brothers, to strum on his Fender Stratocaster, to play guitar. So number one, I saw from a very early age that it definitely was a medicine, at least for certain conditions under certain circumstances. And that really stayed with me for my entire medical education, where they don't teach you very much that's helpful about cannabis. Number two, my father, Dr. Lester Grinspoon, was a very legendary cannabis specialist in his own right. He did a deep dive into the literature, and actually in 1971, he wrote a book called Marijuana Reconsidered, which called for legalization. Again, just as Richard Nixon was starting up his war on drugs. I mean, my dad's book was a bestseller. It was reviewed on the front page of the New York Times Book Review, and it really got a lot of people thinking, how dangerous is cannabis really? Is the government telling the truth about it? And is criminalization really healthier way to go about it than just legalizing it and regulating it? So my dad was involved in the conversation, for the last half century until he passed away a couple of years ago. So I grew up with all these academics, all these intellectuals, all these activists, people who were debating and discussing whether or not we should legalize cannabis. Most of them were pretty in favor. They're like, smart people that were ahead of their times. So growing up, I associated the smell of cannabis smoke not only with healing because of my brother Danny, but also with sort of intelligent conversation and laughter and creativity and sort of all these pro-social sort of intellectual giants in their own field really working together to try to make the world a better place. So I think it's fair to say that I had a slightly different introduction to cannabis than most people. But between watching my brother benefit from cannabis, watching my dad and all of his colleagues, all of his cannabis colleagues, his medical colleagues were not nearly as open-minded about this. Now, 50 years later, people are coming around. And then between treating people with cannabis myself for the last couple of decades, I feel like I have a very well-rounded and sort of panoramic view, both of what cannabis can and can't do as a medicine, what its benefits and harms are, but also on the social history. And, if there's any issue where you can't completely disconnect the science from the social history, it's cannabis. And as you know from reading it, I go into that a lot in my new book, Seeing Through the Smoke.
Yeah, when you touch on the science there, you've got this phenomenal quote, page 3, when you say you're like, not even the scientific literature is objective when it comes to cannabis. Could you unpack that?
Well, absolutely. I mean, during the U.S. government funded 80 to 90% of the drug research worldwide over the last 50 years. And, they wouldn't fund any studies or researchers who were studying the benefits of cannabis. They only were interested in proving harm. So if you were studying anything or studying cannabis, studying drugs, and were a researcher, the only way to get funding from the National Institute of Drug Abuse, which controlled the purse strings of the studies, was to show that something that was lost. You had a lower IQ, you had a lower sperm count, you had a lower motivation. And they just weren't interested in funding benefits of cannabis because they were waging this war on drugs for the last 50 years. And the war on drugs, it didn't really work without cannabis. You needed cannabis to run the war on drugs. You can't just there weren't enough heroin and cocaine users to really create enough of a moral panic. So they really needed to demonize cannabis. So we have all this cannabis research, which on the one hand some of them are really legitimate studies, but on the other hand, it's not really science if you're just looking in one direction. They weren't saying, is cannabis harmful or beneficial for X, Y, and Z? They were saying, let's show that cannabis is harmful. So it's not really science when you are trying to prove a foregone conclusion and when you suppress any results that are contrary to that sort of negative picture that you're trying to paint so you could taint cannabis. So the analogy I have, I don't know if it's a great analogy, is like, baseball is a very popular sport in the United States. And we had a big scandal with people who use steroids. And it came out after the fact that they were using steroids, which is cheating. So several of the people who hold the records for home runs used steroids. So did they hit the home runs? Yes. Were they on steroids? Yes. Do you really count that as a record? It's hard to say. Probably not. And I look at a lot of the cannabis research that was done during the war on drugs in the same way. It was scientific research. And many times there were very good researchers that did it. They were just trying to make a living and they couldn't get anything funded that potentially showed benefits of cannabis. So there are a lot of studies, but you sort of have to look at them with an asterisk because you have to understand the context, which was this wasn't neutral science. This was science with an agenda. Fortunately, now worldwide, especially in Canada, Europe, Israel, less in the United States because it's still very, very tightly controlled, but we're getting there. It's getting better. Fortunately, now people are looking at both sides of the cannabis issue. They're looking at benefits as well as harms. But, that's really following what millions of patients have found, that it is beneficial for a wide variety of clinical conditions, which we'll discuss.
So, I mean, at the very beginning of the book, you essentially the entire book it's themed with the urgency of for the individual that's approaching cannabis to detach any form of emotional bias and look at the objective literature from both sides and just analyze it through that lens. And you've got this perfect metaphor where you say, let's leave Plato's cave and take a walk around. And it's just brilliant, because when I read immediately, I was like, oh, that's a brilliant example, because the reality is, when we're looking at the overwhelming negative effects, the negative effects, which seems to be, that's all cannabis produces, that's the shadows on the cave. That's what we're looking at there.
Absolutely. I mean, I thought the shadows in the cave were sort of the war on drugs, but you could kind of interpret the metaphor any way you want. But it's really just incredible how, I mean, citizens all over the world, I mean, I could speak most clearly about Americans because I live in the US. Americans are waking up to the fact that they've been sold a complete bill of goods about cannabis, that much of what they've been taught just isn't true. And this is why, at this point, 94% of Americans support legal access to medical marijuana. The support for recreational marijuana is very high as well. It's like 70%, which is incredible. But especially when my dad wrote his book, Marijuana Reconsidered, 12% of Americans supported full legalization of cannabis. So that number actually went up about a point for every year that my dad worked on it. And it was not unrelated to my dad's work, believe me. Yeah. But now we have 94% of Americans supporting legal access to medical marijuana. Now, name anything else that 94% of Americans agree on. They literally don't agree that COVID exists. They don't agree that the sky is, the sky is blue, or that the earth is round. I mean, it's absolutely, who would have thought 50 years ago, when my dad was first starting this stuff, that cannabis would be the issue that unites people, but it's been pretty fantastic to see.
So, could you detail that, as you mentioned in the book, there's a real polarized spectrum of professionals who, on one side, are extremely in favor of cannabis and they'll speak it continuously, and then you've got this other side of the spectrum which seem to be just fearful and it's nothing but a negative instance. So, I mean, how did that polarization occur?
Well, part of it is that the war on drugs really influenced what doctors were taught about cannabis, and some doctors are much better than others at thinking for themselves about this issue. Now, the second factor is that a particular doctor's opinion on cannabis, in my opinion, depends on their vantage point. So if you're an oncologist, something like 90% of oncologists support medical cannabis because they see it helping their patients, and they see very, very few side effects. Their patients are like people like my brother Danny, who are just getting benefit, and their lives are dramatically transformed for the better. Whether they survive the cancer or they don't, it helps people die with dignity. It helps them eat. It helps them maintain their weight. It helps them deal with the nausea from the chemotherapy and the pain from the cancer. On the other end of the spectrum, let's say, are the pediatric psychiatrists. They see the relatively rare, but really tragic cases of a young person, a teenager or a young adult, who has a psychosis that was worsened or triggered by the cannabis. Because cannabis, while it doesn't cause schizophrenia, can trigger or worsen psychosis. So this is what they see. And, I also think a lot of these psychiatrists don't have any lived experience with cannabis. I think if they did, they'd realize it isn't the scary devil's lettuce that they think it is. But they genuinely see patients who are being destabilized and harmed by cannabis. And they tend to generalize and think that cannabis is just a bad thing. I think they could be more open-minded about this. I think they could actually hold at the same time that cannabis can harm some people and help other people. And I think they are starting to do that. There's some groups that are funded by law enforcement and by the rehab industry. Half of the referrals in the United States for rehab come from like kids who have been busted for cannabis. So I think there's a lot of lobbying and a lot of political and economic interest in keeping cannabis illegal. And unfortunately, I think some of these psychiatrists work with some of these groups, and it tends to create an impression that there's like really two equal sides to this. There are two equal sides to this, but it's just really interesting that that most of the patients are way ahead of the doctors. And I think most patients understand that, yes, cannabis can have some harms, but it overall is a pretty benign and helpful plant.
Yeah, I mean, just referencing a psychiatrist there, you've got this really humorous quote in the book where you were sitting speaking to your own psychiatrist, and it was essentially displaying their I don't know, overzeal, over like critique. There's this. It seemed to be like an inaccurate subjectivity, and he was talking about your basis of caffeine, and you write, even when I'm sipping on a watery diet coke during our visit, the note says patient was actively consuming caffeine, as if I had freebase caffeine powder and was injecting it into both arms at once while snorting it and using a caffeine suppository. That was brilliant. I really enjoyed that.
No, but it is interesting how like she happens to be on my case about caffeine because she helps me with insomnia. And she has a good point that I like you shouldn't be taking sleeping pills if I'm drinking 14 cups of coffee a day. It might make more sense to cut down. I have addictive personality, but
Yeah.
I do think it's interesting how little the psychiatrists I've dealt with, and the younger psychiatrists are much better than the older psychiatrists are in cannabis. But I was giving grand rounds, which is a very formal medical talk to hundreds of psychiatrists in New Jersey. And they specifically asked me to talk about the harms and the benefits to this group of psychiatrists because they said they had 3 straight lectures all about the harms and the addiction and the this and the that and the psychosis. And they wanted their psychiatrists to get exposed to the benefits as well as the harms. So I gave a very balanced lecture. I talked about the harms, I talked about the benefits, and 10 minutes before I was done, an elderly psychiatrist interrupted me. Nobody interrupts people during grand rounds. This is like a formal medical presentation. It just said, everything you're saying isn't true. You're lying. It causes X, Y, and Z, and there's no such thing as medical marijuana. It was really astonishing how strong some people's opinions are. And then I got so many emails from a lot of the younger psychiatrists saying, first of all, we support you. Second of all, we agree with what you're saying. And third of all, we're really sorry about so-and-so who interrupted you. I mean, there was half an hour for questions, and this guy couldn't even wait for the half an hour for questions to start denouncing me. So, one of the difficult things about cannabis, and I address this very early in my book, is that everybody has a strong opinion about it. The pro people just won't believe, many of them, that there are any harms. I have close friends that just don't believe that people get addicted to cannabis. And I can tell you, some people get addicted to cannabis. I treat people with cannabis addiction. Nobody dies from it, but it can really derail your life. And the anti-people, some of them, many of the doctors still put medical marijuana in these derisive quotation marks, like it's some fantasy, some delusion that 94% of Americans believe in. And I just think that both sides need a lot more humility. And I truly think there's a lot of common ground, both in terms of benefits and in terms of harms. I think it's very difficult to argue in this day and age that it doesn't help people with pain, with insomnia, and with anxiety. The psychiatrists are really touchy about anxiety because they like to treat it for $400 an hour. They don't like it when people treat it themselves. I mean, to be honest, but it's very hard to argue that it doesn't help people with anxiety, with insomnia, and with pain, and a whole host of other conditions, fibromyalgia, colitis, people with multiple sclerosis. It helps with the spasticity. And it's very hard to argue that there aren't certain harms. Teenagers shouldn't be using it, if they're dying of cancer, like my brother Danny. Or I have a whole chapter in my book about autism, which is a whole thing we could discuss. But generally speaking, teenagers need to just say wait, because it can be dangerous for their developing brains. And we don't know that it's safe in pregnancy. We don't know that it's safe in breastfeeding, and people should only use it in pregnancy and breastfeeding with extreme caution, and only if it's less dangerous than a lot of the pharmaceuticals that we tend to use, which, aren't very safe in pregnancy either. So, of course, it puts a pregnant woman in the position of, what am I going to do if I have chronic pain? I can't just not take anything. And then, as I mentioned before, it can trigger and precipitate psychosis in people who have a history or family history of it. So I actually think there's a lot of common ground that we could all come to. And it's really the people on the extremes that are pulling people apart. But I think many things I discussed, most people would agree with.
Yeah, I think one of the things I was actually on this conversation with somebody the other day, where I was saying, the quicker legalization arrives, the quicker we can identify the subjective endocannabinoid system of the person. We can identify that, and we can also kind of marry that up with the complementary phytochemical profile in each cannabis plant, which will kind of reduce any form of harm. And it seems to be is that correct to say that Canada's walking towards there with personalized medicine?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, I'm a big believer that legal drugs are safer drugs, not just with cannabis, with all drugs. And it's just been such a profound mistake to get law enforcement involved. I mean, if a person's treating their own chronic pain or their own addiction, like if you add law enforcement, then they've just got another problem in addition to the untreated chronic pain and the addiction. So I just think legal drugs are safer drugs. And we've had such a spectacular success with legalization in the United States. We now have it legal in 23 states, 38 states have medical marijuana legal. Yeah, 23 states have it completely legal. Now, it's not perfect. It would be much better if we had a federal legalization that included the whole country, because each state has to do it sort of individually. And some states are doing a much better job than others, but there's just a lot of reinventing the wheel. But once you have legal cannabis, for example, in Massachusetts, where I live, I'm speaking from Boston, in Massachusetts, the cannabis you can buy in a dispensary is safe. It's tested. You know exactly what you're getting. There's no mold, there's no fungus, there's no pesticide, there's no lead, there's no heavy metal. You know how much THC is in it. You know what other cannabinoids are in it. You can get it with CBD, so it's more medicinal. So it's the whole thing is so much more safer and coherent once you legalize it. And then that opens up the door with personalized medicine, because once it's legal, people can actually take whatever combination of different cannabis components. You know, the cannabis plant, as you know, has over 500 different components in it, and different types of cannabis have different effects. Some are more medicinal, some make you sleepy and relaxed, others make you creative and energetic, and you want to, like, whatever, write a book or go out dancing. They really affect you differently. So yes, we are getting closer towards more personalized medicine in general with medicine, specifically with cannabis, but something that's absolutely necessary for that is for it to be legalized so that people know what they're getting and have access to really particular products that they could then use in personalized medicine.
Yeah. The dichotomy of recreational versus medical, is that legitimate in your opinion?
Well, I think some cannabis advocates say there's no such thing as that all cannabis use is medicinal.
Mm-hmm.
I don't agree with that. And then, of course, they're the prohibitionists to say there's no such thing as medical cannabis. Obviously, the truth is somewhere in between. I think there's a big overlap between medical and recreational use. I'll think of an example. Say I'm smoking cannabis on my way to a rock concert with my cousins. That's pretty much recreational, unless you define medical so broadly as to include anything that's fun. And fun is healthy, but it's not really medical. Now, my brother Danny, dying of cancer, smoking cannabis, even though he might have enjoyed it, I wish I could go back in time and ask him. That's obviously medical. It's very hard to argue that's not a medical use. Though many of the uses are in the gray zone in between. I mean, I use the example of, like, I have a patient. She's a construction worker. She's really sore at the end of the day. She takes a puff or two at the end of the day so that she wakes up and can deal with the chronic pain she has from her job as a construction worker. Then she feels good enough to go out and play ice hockey in her hockey league, or to play football or whatever. Is that medical or is that recreational? It's sort of medical in the sense that it helped her go out and do an enjoyable activity, but it's also recreational because she's taking a couple puffs and then going out and playing soccer or football or whatever, softball or whatever. So it's both medical and recreational. So I think there's a very big overlap between medical and recreational. I would say most uses are medical, in the sense that if you do a poll of people who get cannabis from a recreational store, like 2/3 of them say they're using it for chronic pain. 2/3 of them say they're using it for insomnia. So I think much of the use is medical, but there's a very, very big overlap.
You mentioned about cannabis addiction a moment ago, and in the book you highlight very clearly the difficulty in really defining the basis of what cannabis addiction is. And it's obviously the cannabis use disorder with, I think it's 11 different rules, essentially,
Criteria.
elements. Exactly. And so, I mean, how would you, what's your feeling on that moment, and how can we progress forward to something that's more accurate to what cannabis actually, what people respond to with cannabis?
Well, cannabis use disorder has been defined essentially by the psychiatrists, not to pick on them. And they've been very much anti-cannabis. They don't treat people with cannabis. I read their journals. They are just really loaded up on the anti-cannabis stories, and they have very little access to the benefits. And I think many of them haven't even tried it. So it's hard to have a realistic view of cannabis if you've never tried it, you don't treat people with it, and you only see the bad studies, not the studies where it's helpful. You don't get a very balanced and nuanced view of it. They've defined cannabis. Again, this all happened during the war on drugs, and I believe was heavily influenced by the war on drugs, in a way that is so overly broad that it ropes in many, if not all, of the medicinal cannabis patients, which is not helpful. If you give someone a definition of addiction, you're harming them if they don't have an addiction. They get treated with stigma. They get judged. They don't get given pain medications by doctors. They get treated really terribly. So I think by defining cannabis addiction too broadly, we're harming a lot of people. For example, as you mentioned, you need 2 of the 11 criteria. One of the criteria is tolerance, and the other of the criteria is withdrawal. Now, we don't use tolerance or withdrawal when we define addiction to opiates or benzodiazepines, because everybody who takes opiates or benzodiazepines, like Valium, they all have tolerance and withdrawal. It's part of the drug. You have tolerance and withdrawal to your antidepressant. People who are on Prozac have tolerance and withdrawal. They're not addicted to Prozac. The Prozac's helping them. So for all of these other categories, we don't use tolerance and withdrawal. Yet, because of a hangover from the war on drugs, they use tolerance and withdrawal for medicinal cannabis. But tolerance and withdrawal alone is not enough to define an addiction. But according to the way cannabis use disorder is currently defined, if you have tolerance and you withdraw, the psychiatrist can say you have a cannabis addiction. Again, all this does is it ropes in all the medical cannabis patients who are doing really well and harms them. I think we need to start from scratch, redefine cannabis addiction, cannabis use disorder more realistically, away from the historical drug worry stuff that we've been sort of influenced by, and really make it so that on the one hand, we're not roping in people. They say 9 to 33% of adults who use cannabis are addicted. I mean, that's absolutely not true. It's probably more like 2 to 5%, number one. Number two, the quality of a cannabis addiction is not the same as the quality of an opiate addiction. It's not the same as the quality of a addiction to alcohol or benzodiazepines, which you could die from withdrawing. Opiate withdrawal is the most soul-crunching thing you can go through. Cannabis does have withdrawal symptoms. You have poor appetite, poor sleep, grumpiness, but I remember I'm personally 15 years in recovery from opiate addiction. That's what my first book was about. And, I went to so many recovery meetings, and people would be robbing pharmacies or breaking bones to get opiates. For cannabis, nobody's robbing pharmacies or breaking bones. It's not that much of a life-destroying addiction. I don't want to minimize it because it really does harm people, and it can really, really get them stuck in life, cannabis addiction, and get them not going where they want to go. But I just want to point out that it's not a lethal addiction like addiction to opiates or to alcohol or benzodiazepines. And the quality of the addiction is not quite as life all-consuming. But again, people with any addiction need to be properly identified and be treated with compassion and empathy. And I just remember a long time ago when I was at rehab for my opiate addiction, people couldn't believe that other people were there for cannabis addiction. They were like, "You're there for weed?" So I just, and part of that comes from the fact that with so many of the admissions to rehab for cannabis were not, the juvenile is addicted to cannabis. It was the juvenile was caught with cannabis, and the police said to the parents, "Do you want your son or daughter to go to juvenile detention, which is basically prison, or do you want them to go to rehab?" So that they go to rehab and then they get off the hook. So I think a lot of people were sent to rehab that don't really have cannabis addiction, and I think a lot of people don't take it seriously. But I've seen it, and it can really interfere with people's lives, and it needs to be taken seriously and treated with skill and compassion and empathy, but not exaggerated. And that just doesn't seem to be too much to ask for.
You really hit the nail on the head when you said that your preferred definition is continued use despite negative consequences. I like that a lot.
Right. And I can give you an example of that, like a patient that has what's called cannabis hyperemesis syndrome. And that's a real harm of cannabis. Generally speaking, cannabis helps alleviate nausea. That's why it's so good for people who are undergoing chemotherapy or even for people at the end of life. At the same time, certain people that use it very, very heavily, you get a paradoxical reaction to it, where instead of making you less nauseous, it makes you have nausea and vomiting. Now, this is very similar to another condition called cyclic vomiting syndrome. Cannabis hyperemesis syndrome and cyclic vomiting syndrome both involve, you could be in the emergency room or even overnight in the hospital for several days every month, vomiting uncontrollably. It's a horrible thing. Now, the only way to distinguish cannabis hyperemesis syndrome from cyclic vomiting syndrome is to stop using cannabis for 3 to 6 months. If you stop using cannabis and it goes away, it was the cannabis. If you stop using cannabis and you're still spending 2 nights a month in the hospital vomiting uncontrollably, it wasn't the cannabis. It was cyclic vomiting syndrome. Now, I've had several patients experience this, and I've said, we have to stop using cannabis for 3 months. And a couple of them haven't been able to do that. So if you can't stop cannabis and you're in the emergency room or overnight in the hospital several nights a month, I mean, I consider that continued use despite negative consequences. I would absolutely consider that a cannabis addiction.
The cannabis hyperemesis syndrome was, when I first came across it, to be honest, I thought it was another, skunk madness, reefer madness thing. And that's
Well,
what I genuinely
that's
believe.
exactly what I'm talking about. If you lose credibility, it's really hard to get it back. I've had patients say to me, why should I get a COVID vaccine? The government was lying to me about cannabis, or even why should I get a tetanus vaccine? And it's like, once you lose the credibility, it's really hard to get it back. I mean, particularly with a teenager, if you lie to a teenager, they're never going to believe you. And that's the problem we had with our whole anti-drug education, the DARE program. They like told these teenagers these horrible things would happen if they smoke cannabis. Teenagers are really smart. They smoke cannabis. These horrible things didn't happen, and they ended up rejecting the whole message. So, just tell the truth about it. There's no reason to exaggerate. Of course, you have to know the truth before you tell the truth.
Yeah, and interestingly, actually, when people are against legalization because they assume that teenagers are going to become just on a daily basis overwhelmed by cannabis consumption, and what the stats seem to indicate is every region that seems to be in favor, or every region that passes over to legalization and cannabis becomes more readily accessible, the teenage use seems to decrease, and what seems to increase is individuals from the age of 50 years old onwards. It's that age group that seems to be have more of an interest in cannabis consumption, which is interesting considering that that's probably the age group 50 years onwards, which would have been most susceptible to the really intense cannabis propaganda that was going on.
Well, it is really interesting. I think lived experience is a big part of that. With the 50-year-olds and above, a study came out just recently. They reached a point where half of all Americans have tried cannabis at least once. Now, again, this goes back to what we were talking earlier, lived experience. If you've tried cannabis, you can see that it changes your consciousness. It makes you feel relaxed and a little bit euphoric. It's not like, unless you take a huge amount, there's like super strong drug, and it's not like super dangerous like alcohol or like a lot of other drugs. And I think people are getting more and more lived experience with cannabis, and that immunizes them against the nonsense and the propaganda from the US government and from these diehard prohibitionists. Now, two other things. People 65 and older is the most rapidly growing demographic of cannabis users in the United States. It's really amazing. And number two, it's really interesting, as you say, teen use in the states that have legalized cannabis is either been flat or it's dropping. And there are several theories about this, but nobody really knows why. One theory is that a drug dealer will sell cannabis to anybody, whether they're 50, 20, or 15. And then at the dispensaries where it's actually sold in the legal states, they are so strict about checking your identification. So it might be harder for teenagers to get. I'm not sure I agree with that, because cannabis has always been easy to get. I remember when I was in high school, I had several different dealers to choose from. I started early. I don't recommend that kids start early, but we make different choices for ourselves. 50 years ago, I didn't know much about it. But then the other theory is that it's just not very cool when you see grandma on the sofa taking a puff of marijuana, because she can't hold down her food. It just makes it a little bit less cool for these teenagers. So maybe it's just gotten a little bit boring now that it's becoming legal, and the teenagers are finding something else stupid to do. So who knows?
Yeah, less of a rebellious act. That's what I was thinking, exactly. The same thing. Yeah. And just by you saying that, obviously you're not promoting cannabis. You actually say in the book that cannabis consumption shouldn't be promoted at all. That you make a point where you say cannabis shouldn't be encouraged. Cannabis shouldn't be encouraged. It should be engaged with responsibly, but it certainly shouldn't be encouraged, which I thought was a great thing to say, quite honestly.
Well, we have these ads that I think you guys don't have. In the United States, the pharmaceutical companies are allowed to advertise their drugs, and they are like the most malignant advertisement. They just make all their drugs, which are these super expensive drugs that nobody can afford, sound like they are wonder miracle cures. And then at the very end, in teeny writing and in a really fast voice, they talk about the side effects. This drug can cause your legs to fall off and a heart attack. Well, they talk about it. They really feature the benefits. And I just think we should ban advertising for all pharmaceutical agents. We should ban advertising for tobacco. We should ban advertising for alcohol, and we should ban advertising for cannabis. There's no reason to advertise any of this stuff. People learn about it online. They word of mouth. There's just no reason to be having billboards. So I'm in favor of banning advertising for cannabis as long as you simultaneously ban advertising for alcohol and tobacco, which totally makes sense because those are much more dangerous than cannabis. And then we absolutely have to ban I don't think we ever will because our pharmaceutical industry is so powerful, but we really should ban advertising for pharmaceuticals because they're just so misleading. I spend so much time with my very limited time with patients saying, no, this new drug that just came out isn't better than the old drug. And they're actually lying about how good it is, blah, 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 blah. It's just a big waste of our time. So be fortunate that you guys don't allow pharmaceutical advertising. It's a nightmare.
Yeah, it's certainly it's a different dynamic over here anyway. But cannabis wise, I do think I compare cannabis closer to caffeine than alcohol and tobacco. It feels like it's more, quite honestly, as the years went on, I'm the same. I've been consuming cannabis since I was about 13, and the stage I'm at in my life now is that I'm kind of seeing, when I talk about cannabis, I see it more as a tool. It's like a utility. It's like you can use it to, as essentially as almost like a cognitive enhancer in a sense, and but it's dose dependent, it seems. So it seems to be that if I take like a toke or two, I'm able to be really creative, my productivity goes up and all these different other things, but then you increase that dose and then it goes down. And I think this is something that's kind of interesting, and inevitably that, so what I did do, and this kind of touched back on the difficulty trying to find objective scientific literature, I tried to study the nature of creativity and cannabis consumption. And what I found was that it's cannabis doesn't cause creativity according to the literature. Cannabis, it could, and it seems to be that the way that they're analyzing it, it seems to be inefficient. It's divergent thinking, non-divergent thinking, lateral thinking. If it doesn't conform to these kind of paradigms, then it's non-creative. And what I've found personally is, and the reason I'm saying this is that you went 5 years without cannabis, and you says you were fine, you had no issue with it, except your creative tank was a little bit empty. And I felt that. So I went about 3 months recently this year, 3 months without cannabis. And what I found was, when I was trying to think up stories for the animations and the cartoons, I was kind of running a bit dry. I could still be creative, but it wasn't the same. The way I describe it is, it was kind of like I was fishing, and I'm fishing on the side of like a loch or an ocean or whatever. I'm trying, and I get one fish at a time. Where the moment I had 2 draws of cannabis, it's like there was a stream of ideas and there was fish jumping out. That's what it seemed like.
No, I'm with you on that. I'm going to get in trouble for saying this because whenever I say anything good about cannabis, the prohibitionists and the psychiatrists are like, you're encouraging cannabis use. It's like, I'm not encouraging the use. I just think people have to know the bad and the good so that they can make an informed decision. And I agree with you. I would say, like, if I look at my entire life, I would say that more than half of the creative thoughts I've ever had have been under the influence of cannabis. It just, I mean, this is just one area where science fails us completely. I mean, anybody who takes one puff of cannabis can tell you it makes them more creative.
Mm-hmm.
You know, again, it has to be the right amount. If you don't take enough, it's not going to help your creativity. If you take too much, you're going to be pretty spaced out and you might have a good time, but you're not necessarily going to be thinking creative thoughts. You've got to be sort of in the zone. But, you know, I like the analogy with coffee. If you take one sip of coffee, it doesn't do anything. If you take too much, you could have side effects. You could have palpitations, heartburn, nervousness, insomnia. But if you take the right amount, caffeine for thousands of years has been an aid to creativity and to productivity and to socialization. And I think cannabis is exactly the same way. And you know, in my book, I don't know if you got to that point yet, talking about Carl Sagan, and he was talking about his creative process. The astronomer Carl Sagan was the most brilliant person I've ever met, and he was talking about his creative process under cannabis, and he described it really, really well. Like, it's just amazing for like idea generation, and then the next day you go back and edit it, and some of the ideas are kind of silly, and others are like these really cool ideas that you just wouldn't have had without the cannabis. I mean, cannabis is a psychedelic. The other thing that's funny is that like 75% of the psychiatrists are in favor of psychedelics, and they've given us such a hard time on cannabis. And psychedelics have many of the same side effects of cannabis that, you know, it can worsen psychosis and so forth. And psychedelics can help your creativity as well. And it's just so ironic that they're pro psychedelic but anti cannabis when cannabis is a psychedelic. I just think it's a question of like a herd of sheep that's been bombarded by drug war propaganda, and they can't really see you know, the wheat from the chaff. So not to be critical or anything, but I hate this double standard and the exceptionalism that goes on. But to get back to your question, I think cannabis, you know, people use it for different reasons. Some people use it strictly for pain. Some people use it for anxiety. Some people use it for sleep. I think that tons of people use it for creativity. You know, most of the writers I know use cannabis, and most of the artists I know use cannabis. So I think it really can help people. And finally, the final thing I'll say is this is something you can't really understand if you haven't tried it. Like, a lot of times doctors work without lived experience. I don't have lived experience with cancer or multiple sclerosis or getting hit by a bus, and I still treat people, right? But with cannabis, especially in places where it's legal, I just don't get why you'd be a quote unquote expert in cannabis but never have tried it. You know, one cannabis expert I talk about in the book was talking about how you have one drink and you're fine, but you have one puff of cannabis and you're just off to the races. And he didn't seem to understand that you could like take a puff, you could take two puffs, you could be a little bit high, you could be moderately high, you could be very high. When you're a little bit high, you remember things, you think really clearly, you can engage people. A lot of people, it helps them with social anxiety. A lot of people, it helps them with their ADHD. They communicate better. I mean, it can really help people. And I just think you can't understand that with cannabis if you haven't tried it. And I just marvel, I'm mystified. I mean, how anybody would want to wouldn't have the curiosity to try it if that was what they were devoting their life into studying and being an expert on. It just blows my mind. It's like being a food critic, but not going to any restaurants, or being a travel clinic, but having agoraphobia and being afraid to leave your house. Like, how can you talk about this stuff if you haven't tried it? I mean, it just helps you put everything you read, the nonsense, the good studies, everything in between, in context when you've tried it.
I fully agree, and I think it's fear, and I think a lot of the time, obviously it is fear, but a lot of the time it kind of frustrates me when the notion of enjoying cannabis is something that's not to be considered. It's like it's not yet; it's almost to be ridiculed as if it's not a serious thing. It's like, yeah, what you enjoy cannabis, like that's not a valid reason for consumption.
Well, that's a really important point. I mentioned that I list about 20 reasons why doctors are having some doctors are getting there now. About 2/3 of them support medical marijuana, but which is less than 94% of patients. But doctors are getting there. But there's a whole list of things why doctors are having a hard time adopting the cannabis. You know, one is it's a paradigm shift. Instead of telling your patient exactly what to do, it's more iterative. It's more trial and error. So it's a ceding of control. Another is just that doctors haven't been taught anything about it, and it's really hard to get behind something you don't know anything about. But one thing I mentioned is exactly what you were talking about, which is wait, I just lost my train of thought because I was giving a TED talk. What was the point?
Yeah, it's just the fact of enjoying cannabis.
Oh, yeah, exactly. So think of the statement, take your medicine. Like, medicine is supposed to be something bitter, something unpleasant that we take anyways because we want to get better. And, you know, at least our society is very puritanical. Of course, a lot of the Puritans came from Europe. So you guys have your puritanical side as well. And, you know, the idea that something could be a medicine and could be enjoyed, I think turns some of these medical professionals off. But like, really, it's apples and oranges. Just because some people enjoy using cannabis or because other people take a medicine that has enjoyable side effects doesn't mean it's not a medicine. Opiates can be misused. Opiates can be enjoyed, and opiates are medicine. Cannabis in the same way, it can be misused, it can be enjoyed, and it can be a medicine. They're not mutually exclusive at all, but I think it just makes people, for whatever reason, suspicious of it. Like, they're using it recreationally, so how could it possibly be a medicine? But I mean, again, that's just very black or white thinking. This is such a nuanced subject that we all have to be humble and sort of open our minds a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, as a medical practitioner, you're in a position where, I mean, how difficult is it to integrate endocannabinoid system literature into teaching the professionals? I mean, what stage is it at when you're engaged in that kind of? I mean, is the endocannabinoid system even touched on in the medical community, or is it just like fragments of individuals who are kind of outliers?
Well, the only study I've seen is about 10 years old, and it said that the endocannabinoid system is taught in about 13% of medical schools, which is completely pathetic. Because whether you're pro-cannabis or anti-cannabis, you need to understand the endocannabinoid system. I mean, you want to understand it. If you're anti-cannabis, you could explain why it's the devil's lettuce and, you know, fire and brimstone happen when people use it. But furthermore, the endocannabinoid system also controls so many of the other neurotransmitter systems in our brains and bodies. It's an absolutely integral, critical system. I mean, it controls some of the most basic functions like memory, learning, reproduction, temperature control, appetite, weight. So it's urgent that we teach doctors about the endocannabinoid system. I think that is not taught Number one, because it's relatively new, but that's not really an excuse. It's been around for about 30 years. We've known about it. Number two, doctors are sort of overwhelmed and beaten down these days anyways. I know they are in the United Kingdom as much as they are in the United States. So it's hard to get them to learn anything new. But number three, a lot of it's just a hangover from the war on drugs. And it's younger medical students and younger doctors are starving for good information about cannabis. And they say about 10% of them say they've been taught anything about medical cannabis in medical school. But then, the ones that are curious and, kind of think for themselves, they learn about it. So some doctors know about it, but it's not taught to us in any coherent, consistent, institutionalized way. And this really, really has to improve, because I know they're teaching it more in other countries, and US doctors are just going to get behind on this issue, and there's just no reason for it.
So what is the link between cannabis and autism?
Well, cannabis does not cause autism. That's all. That was nonsense. The link is that there's very intriguing, nothing definitive, but very intriguing studies that, these kids with autism, they have the non-core symptoms, which are the injurious behavior, the outbursts, just trouble getting through in the world. And then they have the core symptoms, which is like the connection with other people and the eye contact. And there are increasingly these studies that show that if you use mostly CBD with a little bit of THC, it can absolutely help with the non-core symptoms of the autism, like the self-injurious behaviors and the outbursts and the impulsivity. And that there are some studies starting to show that it can help with the core symptoms of autism, the connection, the relatability. And this urgently needs to be studied. The psychiatrist, the American Association of Pediatrics, is like, we can't treat kids with THC because, it causes X, Y, and Z. But first of all, we're talking about mostly using CBD, which is an approved medication in the United States for childhood epilepsy syndromes. And second of all, these same psychiatrists take these autistic kids, and they bombard them with like Adderall and Ritalin, all these psychostimulants. They bombard them with Haldol and Thorazine, all these neuroleptics, or with Valium or lorazepam, all these Ativan, all these major duty sedatives. And it's a very difficult argument that CBD, an approved medication for kids, with a little bit of THC for an autistic kid is more dangerous than all these other medications we're just bombarding these poor kids with. So I think there's just like a vast lack of perspective and context, and just sort of a hysteria about using cannabinoids. And if you just step back from it and be like, look at what we're bombarding these kids with. If we could use CBD with a little bit of THC and help them with their non-core symptoms, their outbursts and their self-injurious behavior and their, the behavior problems that make it hard for them to just connect and get along with other people, and possibly even with the heartbreaking core symptoms of autism, the human connection. Because one of the things that virtually anybody that uses cannabis will say is that it facilitates social connection. It facilitates mindfulness and like appreciation of not only nature and art and music and sex, but other people. And if we can utilize this to help autistic kids connect more, that's going to help the parents, it's going to help the kids. And again, I just think it's a vast lack of perspective. The American Association of Pediatrics should be saying, this is intriguing, let's study this, not, oh golly, no, we don't want to use anything like this with kids. I think they've got it completely wrong on this issue.
I mean, over here in Scotland, we've got a few holistic shops, let's say, that have CBD in them, and they're right on the same shelves next to vitamins and minerals and stuff like this. And it kind of begs the question of, do you think cannabinoids should be categorized in the same sense as vitamins?
Well, that's a complicated question. First of all, getting back to this question and the question before, like, I do want to mention that these same pediatricians were like, we absolutely can't use CBD for epilepsy. That doesn't work at all. And then there were the videos of like Charlotte Figge, using a little bit of Charlotte's Web, and then her seizures went away. And now they're in favor of it, and it's an FDA-approved medication. So you'd think that experience of being completely wrong about CBD and childhood epilepsy, utterly 100,000% wrong, and going from being against it to now it's a FDA-approved medication, you'd think that would teach a little bit of humility, and you'd think they'd be a little bit more open-minded about the potential for the use of CBD, with or without a little bit of THC, in autism. And there's a big overlap between childhood epilepsy and autism, 25% overlap. So it's really astounding that these pediatric medical societies are not on board, or at least sensible and humble enough to say, could there be something there? Now, in terms of the regulation of CBD, that's a very, very complicated topic. On the one hand, CBD is not that dangerous. In very high doses, it can affect your liver enzymes. In regular doses, it can give you some symptoms like nausea, sleepiness, nothing terrible. And the main side effect of CBD is that it acts like grapefruit juice. It competes for the same liver enzymes and consequently can raise the level of other medications that you're taking in your blood. For some medications, that doesn't matter very much. For other medications, you have to be in a very narrow therapeutic window. So if you're on a anticoagulant, a blood thinner, an anti-epileptic, immunosuppressant medication, you need to tell your doctor that you're taking CBD, or it's dangerous. I'm a huge, huge believer in open communication between doctor and patient about anything and everything related to cannabis. Now, sometimes the doctors make this difficult, but you still have to tell them about it and be open. It's very dangerous if they don't know about it. Now, so CBD is a medication that is not particularly dangerous, has some dangers, but isn't dangerous. The problem is, in the United States, nobody's regulating it. So if you go buy 50 milligrams of CBD at a store, it could have 0 milligrams of CBD. It could have 50 milligrams of CBD. It could have 300 milligrams of CBD. It could have THC. You don't want THC if you're going to be driving home and you think you're just taking CBD, and it could have lead. It's completely unregulated. So CBD needs to be sensibly regulated, but it also doesn't need to be by prescription. It doesn't need to be a scheduled drug because it's not that dangerous. So I would say it needs to be accessible but regulated.
So, I mean, in regards to wellness, do you think it should be like that's legitimate? Because I think a lot of the time when people are saying, "Oh, I take cannabis because it improves my wellness," that's a very abstract notion of health, So I mean, and I can understand how it comes into conflict with individuals who are very orientated towards localizing an issue. So I mean, regarding wellness and cannabis, where do you think that fits?
Well, you're right. Wellness is a very vague and sort of nebulous concept, and people make a good theoretical argument for it. CBD raises the levels of your natural endocannabinoids and could help promote many of the good things that our endocannabinoid system does. At the same time, it's very difficult to tell with CBD what's the placebo and what's actually the CBD is doing, because if someone's taking a pill that they think is going to help make them sleep better, they're going to sleep better. Or if they taking a pill that they think is going to make them less anxious, it's going to make them less anxious. I mean, you can't underestimate the placebo effect. It's absolutely huge. I mean, just to tell a quick story, my dad, psychiatrist, he was on an airplane. Someone said this woman was having a panic attack on the airplane. She was freaking out. The pilots were like, "Oh no, we're gonna have to turn the plane around. Is there a doctor on the flight?" And my dad, who was a psychiatrist, raised his hand. And then he went over. This was back then when doctors were allowed to use placebos. Now we're not allowed to use placebos because it's considered like tricking the patient, and they're not really getting informed consent because we're giving them the impression that we're giving them something that we're not. But back then, doctors were allowed to use placebos. So he sat down next to her and he said, "I'm going to give you a pill that's going to make you relaxed and sleepy." He gave her a pill. She became relaxed and fell asleep. They asked him to sit next to her. In 15 minutes, they were able to reach their destination. The pilots were really grateful. They're like, "Thank you so much, Dr. Grinspoon." My dad, Dr. Grinspoon Sr. And all he had given her was a sugar pill, but he told her it was going to make her relaxed and sleepy. And he wasn't lying to her. It did make her relaxed and sleepy. She fell asleep. It completely broke her anxiety attack. Yeah, and she was very grateful, and she never found out that it was just a sugar pill. Again, we're not allowed to do this these days. They were allowed to do it back then, but you can't underestimate the placebo effect. So when people are using CBD for something as vague and abstract as wellness, it's really hard to tell if it's the CBD doing anything or it's the thought that I'm taking something for my wellness. And that's why it really is helpful to do randomized controlled trials to see what the CBD actually is or isn't accomplishing.
I find the placebo effect fascinating, quite honestly, because I mean, what does that suggest? Does it suggest that we have a psychological ability to manipulate a genetic expression? Is that what it's saying?
First of all, they used to think the placebo effect was mediated by our natural opioid receptors, and it's actually mediated by our natural cannabinoid receptors. But the placebo effect is very, very complicated, and I'm not a specialist in the placebo effect. I just know, like, we aren't allowed to give a patient a pill and say, this is something that it isn't. We're not allowed to give people sugar pills and say that it's going to help their anxiety. But I could tell you, as a general doctor, which is what I do for my day job, we use the placebo effect all the time. Like, we know that patients just going to get better by themselves. They insist on an antibiotic, so we have to give them an antibiotic or get into a huge fight with them and have them report us and so forth. But we know that the antibiotics is a placebo and they're going to get better by themselves. We use the placebo effect all the time, but we're not allowed to say something is a medicine when it's just a sugar pill. But you're absolutely right. The placebo effect is very complicated, and something that I'd love to know more about.
So you've got a chapter in the book, it's chapter 16, where it's insomnia, to sleep but not to dream. And again, there's a kind of conflict in the people, the way people approach this. So they look at sleep hygiene as a basis of engaging with full sleep, active REM, and non-assisted. So I mean, could you detail the impact cannabis has on insomnia and even the basis of why it is that when you consume cannabis, you don't dream, essentially?
Yeah, well, cannabis affects the different stages of sleep. We don't know what the long-term consequences of that are. I do want to say every other sleeping pill, many of which are much more dangerous than cannabis, affect the different stages of sleep, and we don't know the long-term effects of that either. So I think it's a little bit hypocritical when the prohibitionists are like, we don't know the effects, the long-term effects of cannabis on sleep, when we don't know the long-term effects of any of these other new medications, like the new orexin inhibitors. Like in the United States, they're Belsomra and Dayviga. They're brand new medications. How can we possibly know how they're going to affect people in the long term? Cannabis has been around for 5,000 years. We spent so much money and time trying to prove that it's harmful. As my dad used to say, we actually know how beneficial it is, how relatively safe it is. At the same time, it would be good, it would be excellent to have more studies on how cannabis affects sleep. Again, if we spent less of the last 50 years trying to demonize cannabis and more of the last 50 years studying how it affects sleep, we'd understand, and how it can help sleep, we'd understand a lot more about these things. So again, our lack of knowledge truly about how cannabis affects the different sleep cycles is yet another casualty and hangover from our war on drugs, which the sooner we can abandon, the better. That said, we do know that that the cannabis suppresses REM sleep, which is the part of the sleep where you dream. And so typically, heavy cannabis users don't remember their dreams as vividly as non-cannabis users. And then when someone stops using cannabis abruptly, one of the most kind of notable withdrawal effects, in addition to feeling grumpy, having trouble eating, and having trouble sleeping, is that they have these really, really vivid dreams, because their REM sleep, where we dream, that was suppressed for so long, is now no longer suppressed. So actually, super vivid dreams are a withdrawal effect of cannabis for exactly the reason that you cite.
Thing is, though, I know you're going to have to go, Peter, here, but I'll just a couple more things, specifically on the dream thing. Interestingly, dreaming really does highlight, and the lack of dreaming with cannabis consumption highlights the subjectivity and the intention behind cannabis consumption, because individuals that are suffering from PTSD as a consequence of war and stuff like that, they're going to see that as a benefit. They're going to see that the removal of dreams as a benefit for cannabis consumption.
You're absolutely right. I think I mentioned that in that very chapter, that we could utilize the fact that cannabis, just for the short term, can affect, for example, your memory. You don't consolidate your short-term memories as well. You smoke a joint at a party, you remember who you talked to and that you had a good time. You might not remember every word of every conversation. A couple of days later, your memory is completely back to normal. It's not like a major side effect for an adult who uses it modestly. But you can harness that side effect in people with PTSD that have these really traumatic memories or intrusive memories. It can really, really help with that. You take a puff of cannabis and you have less of an intrusive memory. There is nowhere on earth where you find a bigger chasm between the people with PTSD who use cannabis and the psychiatrists who insist that it makes PTSD worse. You will never find a bigger chasm on planet Earth, even more than whatever, the Trump people and everybody else who believes in that the Earth is round or whatever. But at the same time, exactly. So cannabis suppresses nightmares, and a huge symptom of PTSD can be these nightmares that are just utterly traumatic. They're terrifying. And people who use cannabis report there are fewer intrusive nightmares. I have a patient who has really, really severe PTSD from a lot of combat he saw in the Vietnam War. He's in his 70s, and the way he was treating himself before he met me was by taking about 6 shots of vodka twice a day. He was afraid to leave his house. His liver was very inflamed and ill, and he was miserable. And now he takes like a puff or two twice a day, and he goes out, he leaves the house, he goes fishing, he hangs out with the other veterans, his buddies. His quality of life is so much better, and that's in part because cannabis helps with the intrusive thoughts, the intrusive memories, and the nightmares.
It's actually perfect you say quality of life, because I think that's a phenomenal measure of the impact, the positive or negative impact that cannabis has on the consumer, because you can judge somebody's quality of life based on relatively basic elements, really. You know, and just to finally touch on the medical element again, chapter 17, cannabis and cancer, knocking on heaven's door. So what we know obviously is the cannabis instigates apoptosis, but how effective and efficacious is cannabis for cancer?
Well, that's a really interesting question. In the lab, many different components of cannabis kill cancer cells, and they kill them in a variety of different ways. They like starve them, they cause them to sort of commit cellular suicide, they stop them from proliferating. So in a petri dish, cannabis components are extremely effective against cancer cells. It has not been shown in humans that cannabis treats cancer. So cannabis is spectacular for many of the symptoms of cancer, such as the chemotherapy, the nausea, the vomiting, or the pain from the cannabis, or the anxiety. So cannabis is really, really helpful for cancer symptoms. But I say to people, if you get cancer, if unfortunately you get a diagnosis of cancer, go to your oncologist, get treated with chemotherapy. We have really, really good treatments for many, many cancers. When I was in medical school 25 years ago, that sort of dates me. If you have lung cancer, they give you like 1 to 5 years. Now I have patients who have had lung cancer for like 20 years. It's like absolutely astounding. We can't cure every cancer, but we're really good at treating it. And again, there is no evidence in humans that cannabis cures cancer. So if you get cancer, use cannabis as an adjunct for the symptoms and go to your oncologist and use chemotherapy for your cancer. That said, I wouldn't be surprised if in 10 years, they actually do prove that cannabis is a helpful adjunct to some of the chemotherapy regimens, because again, in the cells, it's very anti-cancer. This is, again, another tragic consequence of only looking for harms and not for benefits with cannabis. We could have been studying this for the last half a century, but we were busier, at least in the United States, locking up Black Americans and arresting them for the nonviolent possession of cannabis than we were studying how cannabis could help people with cancer. So we've really been in the wrong direction. And fortunately, this is heading in the right direction, but we do have a long ways to go.
I mean, inevitably, you see on social media regularly that people that have like far stages of cancer, and then they begin exclusive cannabinoid, like personal cannabinoid treatment through somebody local to them or growing it themselves, and they see a dramatic decrease in their malignant tumors and things like that. Is it a measurement thing that's the issue? Why we have no evidence that cannabis has an impact on cancer?
Well, it's really interesting. As a doctor, I have to say, if you have cancer, get chemotherapy, because it just hasn't been proven that cannabis cures cancer. Now, the reason why it might not have been proven yet is a bad reason, the war on drugs, but it still hasn't been proven yet. Mm-hmm. I know many people that have used cannabis to treat their cancer. Some have ended disastrously. Many others have had these really like seemingly miraculous results. Credible people that I know have treated their cancer with cannabis. So I genuinely believe it's possible, and I'm eager to see what the research shows. At the same time, it's just not responsible. We know the chemotherapy works. So I'm just not a fan of these people using Rick Simpson oil to treat their cancer. And this gets me in the doghouse with certain cannabis advocates, but I just think the responsible thing to do is to see your doctor and to get chemotherapy and to use cannabis for the symptoms. And if the cannabis helps the cancer, all the better. But you think they would have seen that by now. We have study after study, millions, tens of millions of cancer patients. You think someone would be able to see that there'd be better outcomes in cannabis users than non-cannabis users, and nobody's really shown that yet.
Yeah, I really respect that response there, Peter. So I know you're going to have to go, and I was going to just end on this last thing. So as you know, obviously this is going to be going on CANNAMAntv, and obviously I've got like the animation series, and I've got obviously numerous interviews with professionals such as yourself. Now, I got a comment recently from an individual, and I never respond to any negative comments, but this comment, I just wondered what you think of this. So it's like, it says, "Hey CANNAMAN, For every one of your cannabis promoting actions, there is an equal and opposite reaction. You're wasting your time big style. Promoting the zombification of susceptible, fragile minds is deliberately cruel. Once the brain goes, the beauty of the mind goes with it.
Well, can I quote my dad, Dr.
Yeah,
Lester Grinspoon,
please
who was
do.
the original cannabis expert? He said, if illegal drugs don't always make the user act irrationally, they certainly can make the non-user act irrationally. And I think that's a pretty good quote for this, because that's obviously nonsense on every possible level. First of all, you know, the main people these days that are against cannabis are either, as I mentioned before, the rehab industry or law enforcement, because they're losing their cash cows. In the United States, we have this horrible thing called private for-profit prisons, which is just like people in Europe can't even understand how like you could be incentivized to keep people in prison. And people like that are anti-cannabis. As I mentioned before, there's a minority of doctors, particularly the psychiatrists, that are anti-cannabis. I empathize and agree with them when they say that cannabis can trigger or exacerbate psychosis, but that doesn't mean it should be illegal. I mean, going back to my dad's book in 1971, it's obvious that the criminalization of cannabis has caused orders of magnitude more harm than the cannabis has. Even if some people have worsening psychosis, we're talking about 20 million arrests for nonviolent cannabis use in the last 50 years. I mean, there's no comparison to how much harm criminalization of cannabis has done to people compared to the medicinal effects. And it also helps people. And we've been depriving people of a medicine that's a lot less harmful than many of the traditional pharmaceuticals. So when you put all the harms in the scale of legalization and all the benefits, it's not even close. It's like Bambi versus Godzilla. I mean, the legalization is clearly the way to go, which isn't to say there aren't harms of cannabis, as we've talked about, which isn't to say that legalization is perfect. We could do a lot better. It isn't to say that there aren't whole categories of people that should steer clear of cannabis, like we talked about earlier. But overall, it just, the age of like locking people up for using a plant that makes them feel more relaxed, happier, connect with people better, and feel more creative. Those days are hopefully rapidly coming to an end across the world, and I'm happy to be a part of it.
Well, I fully agree, and I'll just, before we go, I'd like to personally thank you, Peter, for all the work you do and for the work that your family's done to contribute towards loosening the prohibition grip around cannabis and increasing the knowledge of what this plant offers. So thank you very much for what you're doing.
Oh, you're welcome. My dad is certainly a hard act to follow, but you know, we do what we can.
You've done this book again. I would strongly recommend buy this book, everybody. This is phenomenal, and the humor. There was a comment as well when you're talking about the police essentially and how there'd been more police saved if they would defund Dunkin' Donuts. That was hilarious.
No, it's funny because we had this whole movement, defund the police, and if we had defunded the donuts, we would have saved a lot of policemen. It's absolutely true.
I loved it.
I tried to put some humor because it's such a topic that people have such strong feelings about. I just tried, and I say a lot of things that are controversial to both sides. So I wanted to add a little humor so that it would sort of break it up a little bit.
It was an absolute compliment to the book, and the book is. I mean, I've read quite a few cannabis books, obviously, and probably to no surprise. And one of them, obviously, Marijuana, the history of cannabis, and various others. And this one is very much so the most objective book that I've came across, and I could feel that you're obviously lived experience, and I can also feel that you're doing the best possible job to kind of highlight, look, this is, to say that this is harmless is ridiculous. There is harms, and there are people that have been harmed, and it came across really clearly in the book. It's a phenomenal piece of work. So links in the description box below for everybody. And again, Peter, thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you for the great questions and the great conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks to Peter for giving me his time, and thanks to you for sticking around until the end of the video. I sincerely hope you enjoyed the content. I'll see you next time.